Greetings, everybody. Welcome. So here we are. We're gathering for a fireside conversation with Jules De Vitto on the riveting topic of tending to grief through transpersonal coaching. Okay, so before we get going, and before I introduce our esteemed speaker today, let's take a few moments to come around the fire together. Take a few moments to tend to what is present and alive in our own bodies and in the space in which you find your body today. So perhaps you'd like to look around the room in which you are through the eyes of an observer who is entering the space for the first time and going, oh, isn't this interesting? Look where I find myself at this moment. Here I am in the space, as if it was your first time in the space. It's just to make sure you are where you think you are. And then let's bring awareness into the body just by taking a few breaths together, inviting inspiration through the nose, releasing a long, slow, steady expiration from the mouth. Let's do this 2 more times together. In through the nose. Release and relax out from the mouth. One more. Inspiration. And release that breath long and slow from the mouth, relaxing and bringing awareness fully into your body now. Feeling the gravity of your connection to the seat, your connection to the solid ground below your feet. Coming home to your body. And we're going to imagine something together. And you can imagine this in whichever way you like, with eyes open or closed. And if your eyes are open, a gentle, soft gaze resting upon your screen, being present with everybody else that's here. I'd like us to imagine we're out in the wilderness and we're all approaching a meadow, an open space in this wilderness. And we're approaching it from our own directions. You know where you come from. And as you imagine approaching this open meadow or glade, you see in the middle of this glade a campfire, a warm, glowing campfire, and it's beckoning, inviting you to come closer, to approach the campfire. So as you make your way out of the wilderness and toward the warmth of our campfire, you notice other bodies coming from the different directions. And here we are, each approaching campfire together. And as we do, we start to notice the faces of all the others who are convening here today. And there's a place just for you by the fire. So find your place by the fire now. And as you take your place by the fire, feel the warmth upon your face. Feel welcome. Feel safe. We're here together to explore, to learn, and discover. And if your eyes were closed, they might be opened now, so that you can look around and see who's here by the fire with you today. And as we look around the fire, we see these illuminated faces, all of us in a metaphoric circle around our fire. And one of these illuminated faces is an elder who's come to share her wisdom with us today. and her knowledge. And this person is Jules De Vitto. I'd like to introduce Jules, and then we'll get going with our conversation. Jules has a BSc in psychology, an MA in education, and an MSc in transpersonal psychology, consciousness, and spirituality. And she's an accredited coach, trainer, and experienced educator. She is the founder of the Highly Sensitive Human Academy, an online community that offers courses, coaching, and resources for highly sensitive people. She is a published author and wrote one of a series of books on navigating loss in a time of crisis. Jules has studied with Francis Weller, who has inspired her work on grief tending. She is passionate about holding space for people to move toward their grief rather than turning away or attempting to fix it, as this is what enables us to open our hearts and to come into a deeper connection with ourselves, others, and the world. Hello, Jules. It's lovely to have you here around the fire with us today.
Thank you, Jevon. Thank you for that introduction.
So everybody will be welcome to ask Jules questions a bit later on. But to get our conversation going, I've prepared a few questions, and I'd love to get started with the very first question for Jules, which is, what is grief tending, and what does it mean in the context of coaching? Over to you, Jules.
Hey, thank you again. And thank you everyone for joining me in this conversation. So this is a topic which I feel really passionately about. And yeah, today I really want to talk about how grief tending does relate to the context of transpersonal coaching. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear from you. And like Jevon said, there will be time for questions at the end. So I think when it comes to grief, there's quite a lot of myths that surround grief. Some of those myths include the fact that many perceive it as a disorder or a pathology or something which needs to be fixed or recovered from. And I think also when we think of grief, we often think of bereavement. Most people associate it with bereavement. And that, of course, is one type of grief. But something else I want to talk about today is how our definition of grief needs to be widened because it does go beyond bereavement. And when we're working with people in a coaching context, we're often working with people who are going through some kind of transition or some kind of change in their life. And it's often when they're in these periods of transition that grief arises. So it doesn't have to be a big bereavement that people are going through. It could be something such as a change in career, a change in relationship, or the ending of a relationship. Maybe they're moving homes or countries. Maybe they're entering retirement or their children have left home. So there's all kinds of transitions and types of loss that we experience throughout life. And as I said, and as you know, as coaches, that many people end up coming for coaching because they're going through these liminal times in their lives. And so I think it's really important that we can bring grief into the coaching context. And we know that coaching is a place to hold space for people's grievances and hold space for these transitions and loss that they're going through. So as I mentioned as well, I think it's really interesting that we tend to associate grief with going for counseling or going for psychotherapy. And there is obviously a place for that in therapy. So it's important if you are dealing with more complicated grief or maybe dealing with trauma, that you're attending to that in the context of therapy. But I actually think that if we are able to hold space for people's grievances in coaching, then the grief doesn't need to become traumatic. It doesn't need to be something complicated. Actually, it can be quite preventative if let's say someone is going through a transition and there is grief arising, and we can hold space for that with them as they're going through it, then it's actually something which can be quite transformative and healing, rather than something which needs to be traumatic. So I think just a few more things to say are, as transpersonal coaches, some of the main skills that we're utilizing are holding space, being in open awareness, offering this non-judgmental, compassionate space and container, right, for our clients. And I think these qualities are the most powerful qualities that we can utilize when someone is grieving. So again, it's not about fixing, it's not about recovering, it's not about getting over something. It's about being present and holding space for that person's grief in a container that is compassionate and non-judgmental. So, a lot of people can fear or be afraid of going towards their grief because they might perceive it as being quite overwhelming, or they worry about drowning in their grief. So a lot of people tend to avoid it. And for me, this relates to shadow work. So I think grief tending is a type of shadow work. And it's really important that we can empower our clients to, turn towards their grief, turn towards the shadow, and know that they can integrate that in the space of coaching. So it's really about resourcing people, knowing that they do have the capacity to stay in relationship with their grief without feeling that they're drowning in it, and also without feeling that they need to avoid it. So I think that's also a key dimension of this grief tending in the context of coaching.
Thanks, Jules. And, as you speak about grief as a type of shadow work process, it makes me think that there will be a lot of clients who come to coaching and they don't even know that they're grieving. And it might be the type of grief, it occurs to me now, that isn't to do with a particular loss, but more of a deep type of sorrow for the life they could have had that they cannot have. Perhaps it's a pervasive or collective experience to do with what's happening environmentally, or if we think about the wars going on, a grief that is not as personal as the loss of an individual's loved one, but more the loss that we experience collectively in the world at this time. And maybe somebody's reached a stage in their life where they recognize, I'm never going to see the kind of world or conditions that I might have liked to experience in this lifetime. Maybe my children won't even get to see and experience that. Would you say that those are aspects of grief or types of grief that show up in coaching as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's really the sort of grief and sorrow that I relate to. It's something I've really experienced, and I've seen a lot in my clients as well. So as you know, I work with highly sensitive people, and a lot of sensitive people are really in tune with this collective grief and sorrow, and really feeling overwhelmed by it, feeling that they're not quite sure how to navigate it because it feels too much. And actually, something I wanted to share with you today was the 5 gates of grief, which has been coined by Francis Weller. And so as mentioned in my bio, I did some training with Francis Weller, and he wrote this incredible book called The Wild Edges of Sorrow. And so I really recommend reading this book if anyone is interested in this topic. So he came up with this framework of the 5 gates of grief. And I'm just going to share these gates with you and then explain how they do relate to transpersonal coaching, and again, the issues that people are coming to coaching for or with. So the first gate is everything we love, we will lose. So this really relates to life transitions, as I spoke about. This sense that, as we know, when people are really struggling and suffering, they tend to be in tunnel awareness. They tend to be fixated on issues that they feel they can't, they can't change, or it might be, for example, the end of a relationship, and they're in tunnel awareness, fixated on the fact that that relationship has come to an end. So in the context of coaching, this gate of everything we love, we will lose is really about helping our clients to open their awareness and find acceptance in terms of the fact that everything is impermanent. This really relates to a Buddhist concept of impermanence. So rather than clinging and resisting the life that we have or what we're going through, it's about helping our clients to find acceptance and new perspectives in terms of what they're experiencing. So everything we love, we will lose is a huge gate. It's something we can all relate to, right? And then the next gate is the places that have not known love. So for me, this relates to the shadow aspects of ourselves, or the parts of ourselves that we have disowned and denied or repressed. And so often what happens in coaching sessions is a client will begin to integrate perhaps a part of themselves which they haven't even been aware of. It could be their sense of power, their sense of confidence, an integral part of who they are. And when they start to integrate that new, or that part of themselves that they've disowned, grief can arise, because there is a process of, as you pointed out, Jevon, realizing that they might have spent 20 or 30 years of their life not acknowledging this core part of who they are. So when we're doing parts work with our clients, when we're doing shadow work or integrating these parts, grief might arise in the session. So it's just important to be aware of that. And again, make sure we can hold space for that. The next gate is the sorrows of the world. So this relates to the collective grief, suffering, the climate crisis that we're going through at the moment. And as I said already, it's really important that we can help our clients to stay in relationship with that collective sorrow. So to not turn away from it and to not feel overwhelmed by it. So from my experience, when we are holding space for a client in a coaching session, when we enter open awareness, when we're using something like the transpersonal coaching model, we can actually help our clients to take value-driven action towards making change, or taking steps towards the change they want to see in the world, instead of feeling this is too much, I can't do anything about it. So that's the sorrows of the world. And I don't know about you, but at the moment, I'm having a lot of clients coming to me with that issue, feeling that they don't know what to do about what's going on in the collective. The next gate is what we expected and did not receive. So this is a really interesting one. Francis Weller talks about how, as children, we expected to be born into a village, or to be met by a village or a community. And many of us didn't have that experience as children, and we're not having that experience now. So a lot of people are feeling isolated, disconnected, especially since the pandemic. So this gate is really about helping, again, our clients to feel empowered to find community, to find belonging, and know that that is important to them, and there can be grief around not having that. And also, just through the act of sitting with someone in a one-to-one coaching session, or even in a group setting, we're helping people to self-regulate and co-regulate. and find that sense of, belonging, that sense of not feeling alone in the world. So I think just through the act of coaching and holding space for someone and helping them to co-regulate, we can help them heal that gate of what we expected and did not receive. The final gate is ancestral grief. And the way I relate this to coaching and transpersonal coaching is I think it's really important that when we're sat with a client, we're aware that they are carrying ancestral grief or ancestral trauma, intergenerational trauma. And as we know, it's not our role to take them back to the past and unpack or try and analyze the story of where that grief or trauma came from. That's not what we're doing. But we can hold space for it in the here and now. And I think one way this can show up is if a client is struggling to let go of some beliefs, or they have some blocks and limiting stories about themselves, and you're noticing that they're finding it really difficult to transform those beliefs. It might be because it's ancestral, it's something that's been carried through many generations. And if that is the case, again, it's about just being present with that and holding it in your awareness and knowing that the coaching process involves layers of unpeeling different aspects of that person's beliefs or grief that they might be carrying. And then there is one gate which I feel is missing from these 5 gates, which I've been reflecting on. So I've noticed that in my coaching, and obviously we talk about this on the course as well, that a lot of people are going through spiritual crises, or maybe a dark night of the soul, or they've experienced a disconnect from their religious belief system or the spiritual belief system. And so if someone is in that dark night of the soul or that process of a spiritual crisis, they're going to potentially have grief around feeling disconnected from, if they believe in God, it might be God or collective consciousness. So whatever their belief system is, obviously we use their belief system, but I've noticed that a lot of people can be carrying grief around that disconnect from the spiritual. And so again, it's important to be aware that that might arise when someone is in some kind of spiritual crises.
Jules, thank you for that. This just makes so much sense, including the gate that you've introduced. I can personally relate to that. And I might go so far as to say it needn't be a spiritual type crisis, but the realization that my entire culture or heritage doesn't resonate with the way in which I feel and perceive reality these days. The setting of my childhood experiences, the entire childhood experience, for example, might be very different from how I experience myself in reality these days. And then, of course, the realization is, what kind of a childhood was that? Or what kind of a period of my life was that? I'll never get it back. Things could have been better. Things should have been better or different. So the process of coming to terms with that. And I guess this is the type of phenomenon most, if not all of us, will confront at some stage when we're on a path of personal development. The realization that I'm no longer the person I was, and how do I reconcile all of that and still, don't necessarily feel the need to cut ties completely with those that I felt close to before, my tribe, my community, my family, and move completely away from all of that. How do we navigate that territory and that process of reconciliation? And grief seems to be at the very core of this. I think that's how I'm understanding the gate that you've just introduced. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. And as you're talking, it's reminding me of the fact that when we are grieving, we're often going through different stages of grief. And so some of you might be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who came up with these different stages of grief. Yeah. And so those stages are bargaining, anger, denial, depression, acceptance, and then meaning. And in relation to what you said, Jevon, I have found that, yeah, when someone's going through that process of stepping into a new identity or letting go of the past or who they are no longer being anymore, they might experience these different stages. So they might go through a process of denial, bargaining. So yeah, wanting things to be different, wishing things were different. They might have anger arise. Depression, I understand that as a low mood or low energy or just not feeling empowered to move forward in life or having lots of doubts. So Elizabeth talks about how these stages are not linear. So they're not a linear sequence that we go through. And I would take it further than that because I actually understand these stages as parts of us which are always present all the time. So when we're in that grieving process, we're going to have a part of us which is carrying anger, a part of us which is in denial, a part of us which is trying to bargain or make things different. So I think when we're sat with someone in a coaching session, it's good to be aware that these parts might be coming to the forefront. And again, we're not trying to fix these parts. We're not trying to get rid of them. We're trying to understand what those parts are feeling and what those parts need. And I think the stages of acceptance and meaning are the most important in the context of coaching, because if we can hold space for our clients when they're struggling with anger or low mood or that denial, then eventually our clients can get to a point of finding meaning and finding acceptance. So my question is always, how can we help someone find meaning from this process? And it's not going to happen straight away. We don't want to rush that process, but eventually they will be ready to find meaning from it. So if I think about from my personal experience of what you were talking about, Jevon, when I went through quite a big life transition in my early 30s and I moved countries, I changed careers, I went through a relationship breakup, I had financial crisis, everything seemed to kind of shatter in my world and I was going through a lot of grief. So at the time, I was experiencing all of these different parts of myself and stages, but with support now, looking back, I can apply meaning to that experience. It is meaningful to me, and I can see how it was part of something much bigger in terms of my life purpose. So I think that's something really important and empowering and something we can help people to do through coaching sessions.
That's really valuable, Jules. Thanks for sharing your thoughts around that. And yes, it starts to become clear what our role is as a coach in all of that, which raises another question. But I'd like to turn to Jo, who's got her hand up, and hear from you. Do you have a comment or question, Jo?
Thank you. Just briefly about your 5 gates of grief. I wondered whether you saw them as in sequence, or are they layers of being?
Good question. They're definitely not a sequence. They're not an order. So yes, I would say layers of our being, or something that we can experience all of these gates at different periods in our life, or all of them at the same time. So yeah, similar to the stages of grief, they're not linear. I really see it as a framework. So these gates are a framework for trying to make sense of what sort of grief we are experiencing. And some types of grief can overlap and fall into different gates at the same time.
What's coming up for me is that we're talking about grief and the supporting clients who present grief, or when grief arises as a phenomenon associated with their process, which occurs in relationship with us as the coach. And traditional coaching is typically about goals, the future, potential, and all that motivation stuff. And this grief work feels a lot more like it should be situated within the context of therapy. So I'm just wondering how we as transpersonal coaches, as ASE facilitators, walk that line between coaching and therapy, especially in this consideration when grief presents.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. And there are overlaps, obviously, and I know this is a conversation that often comes up around what are the boundaries between transpersonal coaching and therapy, because a huge part of what we do is hold space and enter open awareness. And as I said at the beginning, offer this compassionate, non-judgmental holding space for our clients. And that's why it does align with the context of transpersonal coaching, because we're not as focused on specific goals and outcomes, even though that does come into it as well. So something I like to say a lot is holding space for someone or finding acceptance and being with, let's say, the process of grief doesn't mean being stagnant. It doesn't mean that we're staying stuck there, or our clients are just ruminating over what's going on and there's no movement. It's actually the opposite. So what I've experienced is in transpersonal coaching, this container we create is very alchemical. So it's a space for transformation to occur. And our clients are then going to be able to gain new perspectives, new awarenesses, feel resourced to take steps towards, as I said earlier, finding meaning and purpose, potentially from the experience that they're having, and also take small steps towards, let's say they're experiencing grief related to the sorrows of the world. As I said earlier, they're feeling that they can actually take value-driven action towards the change they want to see. So they're not just feeling disempowered. So that's how I think it applies to coaching work. So we're also helping our clients to feel resourced. As I said before, talking about self-regulation and co-regulation, we're helping them to learn these skills so that they are not feeling overwhelmed by what they're going through. And also, I think in therapy, a therapist is probably going to work more with the client's younger parts, which are carrying grief. So they're going more into, the past and working with those inner child parts. But we'd be working more with the protective parts and helping those parts to find out how they can still be there, but in a more resource way. So as an example, the part which is carrying anger around the grief or denial around the grief, in coaching, we can work with those parts. So those are some of the differences that I've experienced in the way that I can see it aligning with coaching.
Thanks, Jules. I imagine a question that others may have is, okay, so when those parts surface that are in some way linked to grief, and it occurs to me that shame might be another one. Client might not want to acknowledge the existence of that feeling or emotion, and it may remain the elephant in the room during a coaching session. If the coach doesn't help the client to identify there's something here, which sort of points to why we as coaches need to be really attuned and in deep rapport with our clients so that we can sense what's arising with them and help them to tune into what's within them that might not yet be fully in their conscious awareness. Because I think we're able to calibrate to something's going on for the client, but they're not able to put words to it or not willing to put words to it because maybe they're embarrassed, maybe there's shame. So you spoke earlier about being a compassionate container, being regulated ourselves, co-regulating with the client. And I'm wondering if there are any additional steps or any advice for new coaches. How do we help clients to face or lean into these difficult feelings and these darker aspects that are looking for expression and need to find that expression in order for them to let go of the person, or for the person to be able to move on in some way? I don't know if my question makes sense, but maybe
It
you can make
does.
sufficient sense
It
of it.
does.
Okay.
And it reminds me that, again, when we're working with grief, it's actually a very embodied process. So we want it to be very embodied. So when people struggle with grief or letting go of something, it's usually because they're stuck in the mind. They're stuck in rumination. They're very much up in the head. So something we don't do is go too much into the story or the narrative around what's going on for them. We want to help them to come into the body. And so talking about parts, let's say, again, I'll use the example of anger. If someone is really struggling with lots of anger around an experience they've had, let's say the end of a relationship. So as coaches, we can help them to identify where in the body they're experiencing that anger. So the first thing I would do is ask my client, so where do you experience that in the body, that emotion? If that emotion had a label or a name, what would it be? If it had a form or an image, what would that form or image be? So many of you will be familiar with this process. It relates to the shadow integration process that some of you are trained in. So it's really about identifying where in the body that part is, and then trying to understand what that part is feeling, what that part needs, and how we can find a way to meet those needs in a way that is aligned with the person's authentic self. So there's a whole process we can go through of communicating with that part, finding out what it's feeling, what it needs, what its values are, and taking small steps to meet those needs in a way that is aligned with the person's authentic self. So that is one process I would work through with a client if they have a part which is struggling. So I think, yeah, just identifying and labeling and naming these parts is so powerful in itself.
I'm fascinated by this link between meaning and grief. And it's, it seems to be that this whole concept of finding meaning is sometimes problematic because, you read, for example, Frankl, right? And he says, meaning is everything. Meaning is what changes your perception of the world. And perhaps that's a solution to grief, someone might say. You need to find meaning. But I've always thought that meaning is something to be discovered and not manufactured. Now, how easy it is for us to say, you have to go and look for the meaning, find the silver lining in the gray cloud, But that's so artificial, isn't it? And I suppose if one looks at it from a parts integration theory, what you're actually doing is you're allowing the parts that might find meaning to have a voice, because they probably don't have a voice at the moment. They're behind in the queue, because the parts that don't see meaning are those that have the mic in a way, that have the power at the moment. But there's always this I mean, so if we are just holding space, this might be a criticism, right? Someone might say to you, if you are just holding a space, you're just listening and allowing your client to verbalize their grief, but you are not moving them along, then surely you're just allowing him to marinate in this negative space, and you're not really helping them to move out of that space. You're not helping them to find meaning. I'm not saying that's the case, but someone from the outside listening to us might be saying exactly that. So where's the meaning that you are helping your client to find? It's that very fine balance, isn't it? About associating into the negative experience, but at the same time, allowing the sort of positive to find your client instead of sort of actively trying to make it up in a way.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So I definitely agree that meaning is not something that can be forced. It's not something we can rush our clients through. If they're not ready to find meaning from their experience, it's not going to happen. And we definitely shouldn't force it. But I think it's really interesting what you're saying, because as I said earlier, I think often when we think of holding space, many people think nothing's happening, that we're just sitting there, we're just listening. But it's so much more than that. And I actually have experienced that when we are fully embodying open awareness, and we're helping our clients to do that. And as I said, I use this metaphor of the alchemical container, because that's what I have experienced that we're creating. And grief is this very liminal space. It's a very, when someone's in grief, they're often in chaos, or it's a space of not knowing, like they're quite ungrounded if they're going through a life transition, let's say. And that's similar to the space that we create in the context of coaching. There's a space of not knowing what's going to emerge. And actually, I think it's in that space where we often think nothing is happening, everything is happening, right? And that's where the meaning can emerge from that container, from that space. But we have to create that space for it to be possible. So if we don't create the container, then there isn't an opportunity to find meaning. So if we don't attend to our grief, if we don't give space to it, there isn't an opportunity for meaning or healing to come from it. That's my experience anyway. So this is why I think it's so important that we are doing it in the context of coaching.
I'd love to offer two pieces of two ideas that occur to me in response to what Henny has said. Yeah, I agree. If the client is just allowed to marinate in that negativity or grief, it just becomes like this stew of mud that the client becomes stuck in, right? And then, depending on the professional's relationship with that client, they may return for future sessions to stew some more with that practitioner, but that's not our job. So the container, as I understand it, that we are co-creating with the client is one in which they feel safe enough to really lean into the experience that they're having, not to marinate around it, but to feel it fully, to recognize it's safe to feel this way. It's safe to say these things to my facilitator or coach. It's safe to be in their presence. It's okay to be having these feelings. And that quality of leaning in or embracing while being witnessed, feeling safe, is a different quality to the just harping on in a negative loop. And so leaning in that way might offer insight. It might offer a break in the pattern of always thinking and behaving in that one way. That was the one idea. The other one is, because Jules, you've referred to open awareness, and open awareness can also be understood as an expanded sense of self in which we are no longer identified exclusively with the part that has been triggered. And you have referred to grief, and I think this is a very novel understanding, that grief and the different stages of grief are largely occurring due to a particular part that is at effect. And as we are affected by that part and that stage in our grieving process, open awareness allows us to become less identified with that part. As we expand to experience more of the authentic self, the part is seen for what it is, and we're therefore able to see how that part is the way it is, identify what its needs are, identify why things have led to why they are that way. So it is a zooming out. It is a seeing the bigger picture from as Henny has shared with me in the past, a warm dissociation. We're looking upon it as a distant but engaged and connected witness. And that can lead to meaning. And that was Henny's first challenge to us today. How do we allow meaning to arise from the process as an organic unfolding rather than synthetically trying to lead our clients toward achieving meaning, by creating safety and their ability to lean in and then expanding to go beyond and to see the bigger picture from where meaning might be very naturally derived.
So I'm very curious, Jules, in your differentiation or also relating to the differences between grief and what came up for me sometimes. Maybe it's also related to the marinating part, the more judgmental perceived self-pity, or this idea of I'm kind of diving deep into my own sorrows and sadness and tiredness, and I'm kind of almost keep myself there because I somehow maybe find comfort in this place, or I can relate differently to the world, or it's an attachment way of connecting or wanting to belong. So I'm curious how you differentiate these parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what comes to mind is that, grief is really, and it relates to what we were just talking about with Jevon and Henny, that for someone to really process their grief, it really needs to come from a very embodied, and I experience it as a heart space, having a very open heart and really feeling it in the body. I think when we go into narrative, as you're speaking to, those are parts of you which are at the forefront for a reason. So I would encourage you, or whoever it is, to work with those parts which are stuck in the rumination, and find out why. Why are they choosing or needing to stay stuck in the stories? It's probably because, there's something which that part needs and it hasn't been able to meet that need. And when that part can find a way to have that need met, then it can begin to let go of the stories. And then as a whole person, you can come more into the body and really feel the different emotions that come up with the grief. Because often, the narrative as well is what keeps us away from really, really feeling. It can be a protective part, which is stopping you from actually feeling it fully. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but
Yeah, sure. The embodiment part, I think it's so important. And what I found in my personal journey, that after grief, there might be a feeling of huge emptiness or tiredness. So because somehow I've stored a lot of things, and then I allowed things to come and to process. But there might also occur emptiness, which I perceived in situations that I encountered as also valuable for the emergence of something new. And then maybe we can connect the dots to to Henny's artificial meaning making, or where does it actually come from? And so this emptiness, I feel personally, can also feel very scary, which is another level of maybe entering into grief and really, really letting go of some things. So I wonder if you can relate to those experiences.
Something I've experienced with grief is that when we fully embody it and process it, and we're with it, not from the mind space, but from the heart space, I've actually experienced that we're more able to tap into our full embodied human experience and experience joy and beauty and love. And that's why I feel so passionate about this topic, because I think the more we can go into our grief and the shadow aspects of who we are, the more we can actually experience joy and aliveness. So I wonder if in what you're describing, that emptiness is another stage or a part of you that is coming before that fully embodied joy and embracing the human experience. So again, I would work with that as a part of you that is experiencing emptiness. What does that part need? And just holding space for it, knowing that it's not something, again, that we need to get rid of or fix, but to understand it, to understand why there's an experience of emptiness. Where's that coming from?
Yeah, thank you.
Jessica, I'm really grateful that you raised that experience, and I think a lot of people will relate to it. And as I understand it, it's a void that is there between that time of letting go of what no longer serves us, of the past that we're no longer invested in, but the new emerging self, the new emerging future hasn't yet fully manifested, and we're in that liminal space between the old and the new, and it's very uncomfortable because it's wrath with uncertainty, and the ego will tend to want to grab onto something familiar, the old narrative, but we're, through our discipline practice, trying to not go there. And we may find ourselves wanting to grasp for some steady ground. And so I think the invitation to us that really want to get through this in a natural, ecological way would be to sit with that void and the emotions that it may give rise to, and to lean in. And of course, when we're sitting with and invited to lean into that, in that safe container that a transpersonal coach or such a practitioner can help us to establish, it's so much easier. When we're doing this all by ourselves and we don't have that quality of support, we can so easily fall into old patterns and get stuck there. So I think this might point toward why a grief-informed practitioner is such a valuable companion to have in such instances, who can hold that compassionate space for us, and who's familiar with this territory themselves. And Jessica, very clearly, to what you've shared, you're familiar with it, which means you're well on your way to being that quality of presence for others who will confront this sooner or later as well.
I'm glad you used the term grief-informed, because that was something I wanted to mention today, that I think it's really interesting how we often talk about being trauma-informed, and that's such a buzzword at the moment, being trauma-informed, and it's really, really important that we are. Yeah, I don't hear many people talking about being grief-informed, and that was really one of the things I wanted to bring to the session today, that if we do anything, I think it's just being informed about grief and the stages and the gates. I think just having that knowledge and that awareness in itself is so powerful. So when we're sat with our clients, we can at least, identify that this could be grief coming up, and then know that we can hold space for it. So I think being grief-informed is just as important as being trauma-informed. And the two are interconnected as well.
I think what's arising for me from what you've shared, Jules, is that we all experience grief. It's a very natural phenomenon. Some of us are more aware of our grief than others. And we may, as practitioners in this field, have many a client who is not aware that they're grieving, but they're stuck. And they may find themselves in that space like the one I understand to be what Jessica has described. We're moving on from something, but we haven't moved on yet. And we're in that space in between. And grieving may very well be a prerequisite to being able to move on without the baggage of the past. We need to be able to confront what it is that has been holding us back before it lets go of us. So I think, like meaning, we can't necessarily let go of something and just shove it away and move on. It's almost as if it's something that needs to let go of us. And then we find ourselves moving on without it. So as I understand it, grief isn't something we try to prevent, stop, or let go of. We lean in, and through the full embrace of the experience, it becomes integrated. And it's that integration which can be felt as a letting go, a releasing. So we don't try to let go or release anything, but the release happens through that full embrace of the experience just as it is.
Yeah, and just one more thing to mention about that. It's reminding me that often when we're sitting with clients, we might pick up from them this urgency to move forward, or this sense of, wanting to fill that void with the new. So we don't like being in this space, this liminal space, this space of uncertainty. But if we as practitioners can help our clients to stay with it, as you're saying, and not rush and not fill that void with something which is just going to lead to them not feeling aligned or satisfied with their life. So there's something really important about staying in that space of uncertainty and knowing it's okay. So even as coaches, it is okay to stay with that space of uncertainty and to not get caught up in that urgency that can often come from our clients to rush forward.
Thank you for mentioning the urgency. I think that's that's really good. I think the word for me that hasn't been said yet is attachment, and how we attach to ideas about ourselves that can interfere with us being able to experience grief, because we feel that we have to let go of something. The death of a parent is about, or especially a second parent, or however many parents you have, the last parent, it is also about that level of being an orphan and having to step into a different sort of status and place in your family, and the attachment to the child, being a child, being supported, having that sort of upper layer. That's just one example, but I notice, or getting divorced, separating, the attachment to being somebody who's part of a family, or those are it's about, for me, in my explorations with grief with clients or with myself, it's about having the courage to ask the question that's behind going the next layer down, and saying, well, what does that actually mean to you if that's not the case? If you're no longer a child of somebody who's living, what does that mean to you if you're no longer in a relationship? And it's very courageous work for a person to do. So, and not everyone can do that. It reminds me, I listened to a podcast this week, which was really amazing, about it, and it was about a lady who was a midwife who had a baby die, and the colleague was talking on this podcast, and she said this midwife decided that she did not want to talk about this situation for a year, and she said, so she was mixed race American, and she said there was a need to be still with it. And I think, as you've alluded to, with the urgency and the needing to be with something, there's that being still allows the meaning to percolate through the layers of our being.
Mm-hmm.
And they can go very deep.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing what you have. And it actually reminds me of something we haven't touched upon today, but something else I feel really passionately about is doing this work in groups and a group container. Because actually, as you said, it's very courageous work, actually, to be with your grief. And so, I think the skills that we learn through transpersonal coaching and the skills of open awareness and holding space and being very present as practitioners, we can apply that to working with groups of people, because there's something about the shared human experience and shared humanity. And when people realize that they're actually not alone in their grief and that other people have experienced something similar, then profound healing can take place. So I just wanted to mention that I think as transpersonal coaches or practitioners, we can also apply our skills to working with groups and helping people come together to share their grief.
I think I agree with that, and I do. And I have done a bit of group work with grief.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is a wonderful thing, and I also think people's nervous systems are really different, as you know, and that ability to tolerate, capacity to be able to just feel into grief and be able to stay present to it is quite different. So acknowledging the courage that somebody's who's taking that on, and just allowing them to just do 10 minutes, and there's little bits of progress.
Absolutely, yeah. And it reminds me that whether we're working with someone one-to-one or in a group, we are always staying attuned to their nervous systems, our nervous systems, and making sure we're staying co-regulated or self-regulated. So that's really, really vital. And we're not forcing anyone to stay with something which is feeling too much. So it reminds me of the polyvagal theory and making sure that we're aware of staying attuned to what our client is needing in that moment, and working with that, because it is different for everyone and everyone's at different stages in their journey as well. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up.
Just maybe a comment. Because we talked about the ability to collectively grieve or enter certain spaces or touch certain things that we kind of need to grieve as a nation, as a collective, as a community. And Thomas Hübel is doing quite some interesting work also around collective grieving and healing our German collective past, related also to our ancestral grief or the sorrows of the world, which are probably all connected. So I found it very, very interesting that sometimes it might be, and that relates to the group and one-on-one, it might be even overwhelming in one-on-one, but maybe the group container can hold us in actually allowing us to grieve for something that we felt we've never been allowed to before, as being perceived as the evil, and not being allowed to grieve for something that we actually created by ourselves. So it's a little bit related to ancestral topics and the place where I've been born, but it's a very powerful approach, yeah, and very, very healing and challenging.
Yeah, but absolutely, thank you for bringing that in, because again, I really love his work, and I think that we should all be doing this grief tending and trauma work, because he talks a lot about the relational field and how obviously what we're doing in a group context, it's having a ripple effect, isn't it? It's, yeah, changing the field of the collective. So I think unless we all eventually have the capacity or the courage to turn towards this grief and trauma and shadow material, then we're going to perpetuate the suffering that we're seeing. So yeah, I think again, this is why the skills that we are trained in are so crucial, because it's only when we are embodied in open awareness that we have this capacity to actually be with it. Otherwise, yeah, it becomes overwhelming and people just want to turn away from it and deny it and ignore it. So yeah, I really think it's so important we're doing this work.
Thanks for that reminder, Jules. Indeed, we need to be these beacons of stability and groundedness and presence if we're going to support others in feeling safe enough to approach these difficult feelings that can arise. And so, once again, just to reiterate something Jules said earlier on, we shouldn't undermine or underestimate the value of being that quality of container for our clients. And not much more needs to be done in terms of technique or facilitation. If we can connect deeply with clients, we can co-regulate with them, and then we invite them to bring into that space whatever is present for them, whatever brings them to that session, and continue co-regulating with the clients so that whatever arises is met in that quality of presence. That, as Jules has described, is an alchemical container, and transformation can happen in that space. And it needn't include the performance of any type of technique or intervention. So hopefully that serves as a helpful reminder that your presence is worth so much in your role as a coach or facilitator here, probably worth more than the techniques that you also have at your disposal. Okay. Well, for those catching the recording later on, if you look at the description below, you'll find this link to Jules's website where you can find out more about her work. For those in the live session, there it is in the chat window. I'd like to thank Jules for sharing her knowledge and experience with us today.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who was here today.
We now make our way back into the wilderness and back into space in which you find your body right now so that you can carry on with what's important to you today. Thank you for being here. Until next time.